Hello and welcome to the 9 p.m. edition of the Urban Debate. We're going to pick up an issue that you usually do not see on national news prime time. And that's the issue of the telecom sector and the pain that has been going on in this sector and what lies in the future. Now, why am I talking about it? Let me just put it in perspective for you. The worsening financial position of Vodafone Idea, the merged company Vodafone Idea, or V as it's known as now, is in much trouble, just like a lot of other players, whatever little bit are left. Because of which, Kumar Mangalam Birla, chairman and promoter of the company, who also owns several other businesses, wrote to the government saying that he is willing to give up his stake as the only option that he sees right now to save the company from an irretrievable collapse. Yes, he actually wrote to an official in the finance ministry saying that the company's financial condition is deteriorating sharply, that we've tried all other methods. We even tried raising 25,000 crore rupees to sustain the operations, but that hasn't worked out, to pay the dues to the government. But the investors right now want to see government intent for a three-player market, and that the financial position of this company, Vodafone Idea, will lead to irretrievable collapse. So I am willing to hand over my stake in the company to any entity, government or otherwise, in order to save the company in the national interest. Why does he say national interest? Because if this company shuts down, then you're essentially just left with Jio and Airtel in the entire telecom space of a country our size, with over 125 crore people in this country, constantly booming demand, people with multiple phones becoming an integral part of our life. In such a huge market, can we have a possibility of one of the three big companies also shutting down? That's what Birla is talking about. Why is it in such a problematic place? Well, just like the entire telecom sector, and their problems have actually began over a decade ago and more, and have only increased and intensified. They went through multiple rounds of expensive spectrum auctions where all companies, new ones that came and went already, took on huge loans to buy spectrum from the government. They were betting big on the future, and they took huge amount of debt to buy the spectrum. And that added to their burden, and that debt really increased with the interest accruing year after year after year. Then came the other big issue, which is the revenue dues, the AGRs that have to be given to the government. Now, a huge fight has already happened. The case has gone into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has given its ruling. Supreme Court even got upset when it realized that the government was actually giving some amount of leeway to the telecom players from paying these dues. They've now agreed that there has to be a 10-year installment plan where every year the telecom players pay a little bit of money, 5,000 crore odd each, to the government each of these years. So that's the added pressure. A huge amount of money that has to be given to the government. Then there is a massive tariff war that went on for a while as Jio entered and took a large share of the market. They came in with really low prices. You and I both know about that. And collectively, all of this has added to the problems of the telecom companies. Now, why should you and I care about it? Why is it something that I am discussing here tonight? Here is why. Because what Kumar Mangalam Birla is talking about is the possibility of another company going bust in the telecom sector. And if that happens, you as a consumer are left with fewer choices. Essentially, only Jio and Bharti Airtel would be your choices. Everybody else, all the other names that were doing around, say, even 5 years ago, don't exist. Anil Ambani's Arcom shut down. Aircel shut down, Docomo exited. So many others after the 2G scam and the court order also had to shut their businesses. So that's one part. You will have fewer options. It could also mean higher tariffs, which is what the industry is hoping for and they are moving towards, But it could also mean higher tariffs, which isn't great news for you. But less competition means that the two companies or three companies can decide to increase prices in their own interest. And you will have to pay it. You don't have the option of switching to another company which may be offering you lower prices. One big issue will be bad service or average service. Who cares? If there is no fear amongst the telecom companies that they will lose you to a competitor, they're not going to invest so much on giving you the best of the services. So get used to more network issues, more call drops, lack of response from the service providers and their customer care services. There is no incentive for them. And the other problematic part, unfair practices. Easy to work together when there are fewer players in the market, which also isn't great news for you. That's how I see it. What is a possible solution? I don't know, but we have telecom sector experts who can tell us. Is there a solution? Is it time for government intervention? What kind of intervention can the government really look at to save this sector from further pain? I say good evening to Mahesh Uppal, telecom analyst, director for ComFirst India, joining me this evening. Vimal Vaklu, former chairman and MD of Telecommunication Consultant India Limited. Ravi Vishwasharya Sharda Prasad, telecom consultant, founder of a think tank on information warfare, joining me this evening. But first up, I want to go across to Sanjay Kapoor, former CEO for Bharti Airtel, joining me this evening. Mr. Kapoor, what is your view? Is there a way we can save Kumar Mangalam Birla's company?
Well, first of all, very good evening to everybody. And, I can only start off by saying that in my eyes, the letter written by Mr. Birla is metaphoric and symbolic in nature. He's expressing a bigger idea and not necessarily about the bailout or sellout of his company. I think he's clearly indicating what you just summarized, which is we need to protect our country to slip from oligopoly to a duopoly, which is neither good for the consumers nor good for the entire ecosystem. And oligopoly is a proven structure across the globe, and we need to stick to it for the right merits that you just spoke about. On the other side, he's also saying that a company like me, which has invested billions of dollars into this business, is now finding it untenable to even meet my ends. And I've reached a stage where if the government doesn't intervene, I will go down. And that is a true factual situation of where his balance sheet and his business stands today. So I think that's what is being communicated. As far as interventions are concerned, I think choices left on the table are very few. The problem is that for their current woes and for their future survival and coming out of this problem, only government can take decisions to bail them out. Till the government takes any decision, there's no private sector guy who's going to come and write a big check for a balance sheet which looks as dirty as it looks. Therefore, what can the government do? After the court orders, I think government now needs to do something out of the ordinary, where the government needs to change some legislations, give them a long rope, maybe a 10-year, 15-year rope to pay back what they have to pay to the government. But for future, they need to make sure that the raw material, which is spectrum, becomes cheaper. The government levies, where they take away about 30% of the top line from the industry in one form or the other, needs to be brought down drastically. And also all other PLI mechanisms that we have to boost manufacturing in our country needs to be put behind telecom to bring up the quality of service, fiberization of the whole nation, so that we are comparable and competitive with the rest of the world. Only those type of interventions can now save this company. Just hoping that somebody will come and write a $2 billion, $3 billion check will just make them survive for a few more months, a couple of more years. It is not going to make them competitive in the market. And you don't do businesses to just sustain yourself in the market. You do it to thrive in the market. And that's the biggest problem that Vodafone is facing. Unfortunately, this is a game where to migrate from 4G to 5G will require a check of maybe $15 billion to be competitive. And they don't have that sort of money. I mean, they don't even have money to run the current business, in a manner where they're competitive on customer experience. forget moving into newer technologies.
So you're right, and they don't have the money even to sustain the current business. That's where things stand. We are talking and hoping that at some point 5G will be here, and that the government will sell that spectrum, and those licenses will also have to be brought, Mahesh Uppal. Thousands of crores of rupee which will be needed again. And without 5G, no company will be able to sustain for too long. So what do we do? What do we do with a company that already has 180 lakh crore of debt on its books? Nobody wants to come in and save it right now because obviously it has 180 lakh crore on its books.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the challenge is humongous. But I think it's worth remembering one thing, which is that Vodafone is a good company with a huge liability. Vodafone is a company which has an exceptionally good network. It has a reasonably good share of market. So the reason to ensure that it stays are substantial. However, looking at the political economy of the environment, it's going to be very difficult for government to justify bailing it out, given that what it is suffering from is essentially what it did in the market. And recall also that the Supreme Court has also unambiguously ruled against any serious kind of bailouts to the company. So really and recall another thing, which is that if government was to bail out Vodafone, a private company, at a time when its own companies are starved of funds and are constantly complaining for lack of investment, it's going to be very hard to justify. And given what the government's own finances are and given the state of the economy, it would be extremely difficult for government to actually come out now and to bail this company out, despite a very strong claim it has based on its performance in the market. So my view has always been that government will have to think out of the box. It cannot suddenly, for example, waive a huge amount of money when other players are paying up. It cannot change spectrum in a short span. It can't. And I think that is why it has to think differently. It has to think politically. It has to think in political economy terms. And there is really the challenge. And if there is some way of trying to not merge or create some kind of an entity which is composed of Vodafone, which is actually a successful company despite the huge liabilities it has, and a company like BSNL and MTNL, which the government is responsible for. Recall that the government cannot pretend that its responsibility to a private company is greater than that of to its own companies.
Fair enough.
Something creative will have to be done, something that would, I completely understand that this is easier said than done. This is not something trivial that's going to happen. But I think somehow government will insist that Vodafone take on some of the burdens that currently the government wants to shed in return for some kind of a bailout. Several other players, after I suggested it, have also talked about this. And I think we will have to think of it in that creative fashion. Otherwise, I don't think in the short term there will be support for the government to salvage.
Okay, so on one hand, there is the argument that for a healthy market to thrive, for the benefit of the users, we must have more players. But on the other side is also the argument that is it the right place for the government to come out with a bailout? And if they do it for this company, they haven't done it for anybody in the past. So many of them have shut shop and exited for various reasons, Mr. Prasad. And the government itself often banks on these players to give the government money. The government itself, by the end of the year, is looking at its own fiscal deficit and hoping that maybe it could have gotten 30,000 crore from a spectrum auction. So then what are government's options, and should it even look at it?
Okay. See, first of all, the financial institutions and the banks have to see how they're going to recover the 23,000 crores exposure and debt that they have, are they willing to invest and take steps such as in the management to recover those 23,000 crores? Because it's going to be politically a very difficult decision at a time of non-performing assets, and the telecom sector has the largest non-performing assets. Secondly, how is the government going to get its 96,000 crores or spectrum fees that are due to it, and the 150,000 crore rupees of AGR, the adjusted gross revenues and spectrum fees? It's going to be a very difficult political decision, especially at a time when the government is divesting and there is a lot of slack over non-performing assets. On the other hand, there was this well-researched Deutsche Bank report which argued for the government to acquire Vodafone and merge it with BSNL. And one of the things is that a large country like India, which aspires to be a superpower, needs to have a national telecom operator, a government telecom operator for strategic purposes and strategic interests. Let me give you a personal example. For the last 1 year, I've been in the Himalayas, and the only network which works is BSNL. The two private companies and Vodafone have virtually no presence at all. It is only BSNL which is working where I've been in Kinnaur and Lahore and Spiti. And so certainly we need a national network for strategic interests, for government purposes, for military purposes, and especially for the USO, the Universal Service Obligation, for reaching out to areas in this. I've just managed to get a Wi-Fi connection to speak to all of you, and Jio, Airtel, and Vodafone all refused, saying that I'm not in a feasible area. And BSNL immediately rang me up, and within 2 days, my Wi-Fi here in Lahore Spiti was connected. So certainly, I think if BSNL is given the chance, is given the right leadership, it can actually work in remote areas where I am, Lahore Spiti. It is the only network which works. And we need this for the Northeast. We need it for remote areas. So certainly, I think there is a case for the nationalization of Vodafone. It has to be done maybe at a token fee of 1 rupee or something like that. There have been recent instances of government bailouts, like what happened for Satyam and I think the DHFL and others, but those were done for protecting the interests of the minority shareholders because the promoters were alleged to have indulged in irregularities. Here, most of the problems of Vodafone are largely because of government policies, the retrospective tax amendment, which will be going in for arbitration appeal in Singapore next month. A lot of it is because of the calculations of the AGR. And certainly the question is, do you just want to have a duopoly in the telecom sector where you just have Jio and Airtel? And we have already seen the tariffs are rising up. And I can say from my personal experience of the last in remote mountainous areas, BSNL is the only network which is working at all.
Yeah, okay. No, I think you're right when it comes to the fact that in far-flung areas, it's still often BSNL that comes to the rescue of people. But does it, Mr. Vimal Vaklu, does it make sense for the government to explore what this Deutsche Bank has now suggested, merge BSNL with Vodafone Idea and save both? Will they be saved?
Well, in my opinion, that won't be the right solution. I have also worked for BSNL for some years, and I would say that will be the last nail in the coffin of BSNL also. The reason being that we should go to the background of Idea and Vodafone merger. The whole crisis, I would say, has started with this retrospective taxing. The government has not been far-sighted. I mean, when it came to, it was more than a decade back when the government that it sort of made Vodafone handicapped right from the beginning. And there was a sort of theory that maybe after merger with Idea, the two companies together would be able to face competition and do well in the market. And we see what has happened to Idea now. And whatever Mr. Birla says today, I mean, he must be regretting the decision of having taken that decision some time back. But the same thing now, if BSNL is asked to take this, sort of tab, the challenge would be the BSNL itself is finding it difficult to sustain. And government will have to do a massive restructuring of the assets and all that to save BSNL finally, which looks a very difficult thing. And we have seen in these years that any amount of infusion, a temporary blood infusion like that, doesn't really work in the long run. In my opinion, the government should try to correct things where the challenges lie. Like, I think government should not pursue that, the first mistake that happened from Government of India of going for the retrospective tax, which also sends wrong signal to the investors. So that's one thing. And second, government should not use telecom as a milch cow. We have seen that it's not only the normal people using telephone. The whole of digital India structure rests on this telecom sector. And if it actually collapses or there's a duopoly in the market, as Sanjay has rightly pointed out, it's going to be a disaster. I mean, digital India cannot sustain on that. So for that, government has to rationalize spectrum. They need not milch it the way they have done with the, you can say petroleum sector in the recent past.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other suggestions like fixing of floor prices for telecom, which I think is a ridiculous idea because in my opinion, had floor prices been fixed in 1995, the actual tariffs would not have come down to the current level. Because of competition, there is innovation, and any floor pricing will sort of stop innovation in a big way, which is not good for the industry.
Okay.
So I feel that government should selectively take corrective actions, but I don't think BSNL should be given this particular burden.
Okay, so we've explored one option which has also been suggested, discussed exhaustively within the industry about the merger. But we've seen what happens in mergers in telecom sector. We've also seen what happens in mergers in similar other sectors with loss-making units. It's barely ever worked out or helped. If we had to look at other ways and other innovative ways, Sanjay, while it's okay to say that in future the government needs to keep in mind the kind of cost it asks, for a license or for spectrum or any kind of tax demands that it may raise prospectively and retrospectively, all of that is only future. What about the current liabilities for the company that it is any which way struggling to service?
Yeah, so that is a genuine problem. If there was an intervention required, the intervention was required when this whole litigation around the AGR began. When the shared definition of AGR was being debated, I think the government could have intervened at that stage and really agreed that you cannot be taxing the telecom companies on non-core revenues, which come from non-telecom assets. But now it is too late for that. So the only way that you can rationalize your decisions of giving a long rope to the existing players on their past dues is by not treating telecom as a vertical, but by treating telecom as a horizontal. The pandemic has accentuated this need. Today, there is no industry, like one of my panelists said, which can do business without being on the telecom services and telecom infrastructure, right from steel to FMCG to you name it. Everybody today has digital aspirations, and digital aspirations cannot be met without access that is provided by the telecom companies. Unfortunately, they are the only guys who invest behind this infrastructure. Everybody else utilizes it on need-based, and the revenues that they give to these guys are pittance. I'm not saying the consumers to be blamed for it, but the operators themselves are to be blamed for it. We all went through a super competition phase in this country where hyper competition was there. There were 12 players, but the prices did not drop to this level. They came down a wee bit, but yes, of course they came down. Right now, the woes of the government are further accentuated by the telecom operators by charging $2 as ARPU from the customers. These services are not sustainable given the longevity of technology, even at $10 in most parts of the world. The operators struggle. The third player makes losses even in those markets. I am on boards of companies that make $30 as ARPU. That's the sort of ARPUs that are required. Of course, India can't pay that, but $2 is absolutely out of whack. Yeah. 5G migration will not happen with this. So I think on one side, the pricing needs to correct. On the other side, the costs need to correct. The government levies need to set right. But the government needs to see that the revenues that they earn out of telecom will not be through the vertical, but through the horizontal. Every company that utilizes telecom services will eventually prosper, pay taxes to the government. I think that's how we have to look at this industry if we want it to be sustainable and surviving over a long period in time. Otherwise, we'll be foolhardy to look at today's problem, and then again, somebody else will run into the red in future.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think, for sure, which is why I started out by listing out some of the reasons as to why this sector and this company has reached here, because we need to know how we've reached here for us to be able to learn our lessons from it going forward. But Mahesh Uppal, for example, Sanjay raises the issue of ARPU. Now, for our viewers to understand, that's the average revenue per user that a telecom company earns, and that's the benchmark that everybody uses to see how how much of money your business is going to make basis what you're putting in. If you're talking about improving that also means a higher price for the consumer. So now I'm going to speak as a user and say, is the future any which ways higher tariffs for me, whichever way the industry goes?
Well, it does seem that the tariffs will have to go up. There is no doubt that most companies now need not only to recover more of their investment, but also need some serious surpluses when it comes to their investments in 5G. So we should expect an increase in tariffs. But I do believe also that much will depend on how the market responds to all this. Now, if for one reason or the other, Jio does not raise prices, then the choice for other players just vanishes. In fact, the main reason why Vodafone is struggling is because it cannot raise prices in spite of there being no bar on raising it. There is no bar whatsoever on telecom companies raising prices. They're all driven by the market. But given what the market leader is charging, there is no way that others in the market can charge anything which is uncompetitive and risk losing market share. So yes, we do think I do believe that the prices will go up, but I do not expect the prices to go up steeply for the reasons I indicated, which is that the market leader may have a different strategy and may want a larger share of the market before such an eventuality happens.
You may be right. One wonders how much more share are they eyeing before they actually allow companies to go forward and hike prices. But that's the strategy they've used, and which is why they stand where they do today. So then we come back to the options and, what can be done, Mr. Prasad, to help, if we do want to help, Vodafone Idea, which many say would be wise for the entire sector. Can the government give some kind of guarantee to investors to say, we're going to look at steps and look at policies that will benefit the sector, so do come in and invest?
Okay, I think first of all, we have to look at telecommunications as a strategic sector, that it is a cost saver, it is a time saver, and it saves the utilization or overutilization of other infrastructure such as roads, transportation. It saves on fuel costs, because if I can do a video conferencing, I don't need to go and meet a person. And that saves a lot on diesel and petrol and other infrastructure. So you have to look at telecom as something that saves time and cost and has a great multiplier effect on the economy, as the studies from ICRIER have shown about the telecom penetration increasing GDP by so many percent. The other thing is that if the government can somehow relook the February 2012 Supreme Court judgment about auctioning of spectrum. There is now a very strong case for making spectrum very cheap or absolutely free, because spectrum auctions are actually anti-competitive. For instance, if I get a brilliant new idea for a new telecom service, I cannot put my idea into practice because I don't have spectrum. I have to wait for someone to go and buy spectrum in an auction, wait for the spectrum auction to be announced by the government, buy spectrum, and then tie up with that person. So it actually, spectrum auctions are very anti-competitive. Spectrum auctions only work when the technology is stable, not at times when technology is uncertain and moving fast. They work only when the economy is growing and stable, interest rates are stable and predictable. Where the banks have liquidity. You cannot have spectrum auctions in the highly uncertain environment or in a recession, or where there is no liquidity in the banking system. So we really have to, the government has to relook at the telecom policies and the spectrum. For instance, there were times when the 3G spectrum, Japan was actually giving incentives, giving the 3G spectrum away for free, and actually giving incentives for companies to bid and subsidize the spectrum. So I think that the root of a lot of the problems in the telecom sector come back to that old Supreme Court judgment. Is there a way of coming around that policy decision of the Supreme Court judgment, make spectrum free? Now, in retrospective, the first come, first served policy doesn't look so bad at all.
Yeah.
So this is a very sensitive political decision the government needs to take. And whether you want to bail out one company or you want to bail out the sector as a whole, bailing out one company will again lead to a lot of political problems. And with the government going in for privatization, it's going to be difficult for the government to justify bailing out Vodafone. But I think there is a strong case for merging it, not paying the shareholders anything, take it over at 1 rupee and merge it with BSNL and try to rationalize the operations and maybe divest at a later stage.
Well, I think whatever decisions are taken, if the government does decide to, intervene in any manner or at least send a messaging of support, which is what investors will be looking out for to help Kumar Mangalam Birla and the company, has to be done keeping the sector in mind. The same would actually also apply to Bharti Airtel, the other player which is there in the market, which is also going to be right now drawing up plans and wondering how they're going to be moving forward in the next 5 years. What will happen when the 5G spectrum licenses are put out as well. So that's what we need to look at. It was a pleasure to have all of you on this conversation. I'm afraid I'm completely out of time, but thank you for joining us with your insights. Viewers, it's simple and plain. Several policies, several actions by the governments, by the companies themselves, the industry dynamics have brought us to a point where the telecom sector's pain refuses to end. Now, companies like Bharti Airtel or even Vodafone Idea have tried everything else possible, from going to the Supreme Court to get relief, from writing to the government, trying mergers and acquisitions, cutting costs by selling off parts of their businesses that don't add so much value to be able to protect the core of their business, to now writing letters to the center. So at some point, the government may have to look at what their view is and whether they want a situation where there is only Jio and Bharti Airtel to a certain extent in the market, or do they also want a third strong player in the form of Vodafone Idea? for the telecom sector to grow, for your and my, not just our mobile phone use, not just for our voice calls or data calls, but for everything else which is digital in our life. These are the companies that create the infrastructure for it. We'll wait and watch what happens next. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.